The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black border and use clear sticky tape to piece the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. If you do need more help with this, we have a comprehensive instruction video on how to print and assemble your pattern. I'll leave the link below. For this style, I have adhered a medium weight fusible interfacing to the main fabric. This will give structure to the garment and help hold its shape. If your fabric is particularly heavyweight, you may not need to use this, but in most cases, it is advisable to use it. Trim around each individual pattern piece and lay the pattern onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. For this style, there is an optional tulle petticoat. If you don't wish to use it, just omit the skirt lining steps. Open out the centre front bodice piece so that the right side is facing towards you. Pin the mid-front bodice piece to the centre front bodice piece, matching the notches together. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side so that both mid-front bodice pieces are attached. Press the seams with the iron. Pin the side front bodice piece to the mid-front bodice piece, with the right sides touching one another. Match along the adjoining notches and pin together. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side so that the front bodice piece is now complete. Place the centre back bodice piece on top of the side back bodice piece with the right sides touching one another. Pin along the seam, matching the adjoining notches. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side so that you have a mirrored pair of back pieces. Place the back pieces on top of the front pieces, matching along the shoulder seams and side seams. Pin together. Stitch all 4 seams using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat all of these steps for the bodice lining. However, do not add fusing to your lining. Once that's complete, turn your lining over so that you are looking at the wrong side. Place a piece of 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch rigoline or sew-in boning on top of the seam allowance. Pin it in place and ensure it finishes 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch above and below the seam edge. Repeat this for all of the front seams, excluding the side seams, as well as each of the back seams. Once all of your boning has been stitched in place, place your lining pieces on top of your main piece with the right sides touching one another. Pin around the neckline only. Stitch all the way along the neckline using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Using a small pair of scissors or snips, clip into the seam allowance at the curved edges. This will help the neckline sit nice and flat when the garment is turned through to the right side. For this garment, pay careful attention to clip into the corners on the front neckline. Turn the garment through to the right side along the neckline. Once finished, press around the neckline sharply with the iron. Next, take one of the pieces of bias binding and fold it down on one of the short edges by 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch. Press it well with the iron to hold it in place. Then, fold it in half along the long edge with the wrong sides touching one another. Iron the bias tape so that it stays folded in half. Match the bias tape up with the armhole. Place the bias tape onto the right side of the armhole. The raw edge of the armhole will align with the raw edges of the bias tape. Start at the underarm point. Match up the folded edge of the bias tape with the side seam. Continue pinning the bias tape all the way around the armhole until you are back at the underarm point. The bias tape should overlap at the underarm point by 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch. Trim off any excess that you don't need. Stitch around the armhole, securing the bias tape in place using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Fold back the bias tape towards the inside of the garment. Press it in place. The bias tape will now have enclosed all of the raw edges of the armhole. Pin it in place. Next, use a hand sewing needle to secure the edge of the bias tape to the inside of the garment. When hand stitching, take care just to catch the bias tape with the bodice lining. That way, the stitching will be completely invisible from the right side. This is how the armhole will look on both sides when it's finished. Nice and neat. Now it's time to work on the skirt. Place the side front skirt pieces on top of the centre front skirt piece. Match the notches along the seam. Pin in place. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for both sides and then overlock the seams. Place the back skirt piece on top of the front skirt pieces, matching the notches along the side seams. The right sides should be touching one another. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once again, overlock the seams. Pin the skirt waist edge to the bodice waist edge, with the right sides touching one another. Catch both layers of the bodice, the main and the lining. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Place the bodice aside while we work on the lining and the petticoat. If you don't want to use the lining, just skip these steps. Place the side front skirt pieces for the lining on top of the centre front skirt piece. Match the notches along the seam. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for both sides and then overlock the seam. Place the back skirt piece for the lining on top of the front skirt pieces, matching the notches along the side seams. The right sides should be touching one another. Stitch together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once again, overlock these seams. Follow the cutting instructions for the tulle pieces in the instruction booklet. You'll have cut 6 rectangles of tulle. Using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, we'll be joining all 6 pieces together at the short end to create one long strip. Continue stitching all of the short ends together until you have one long piece. Once that's complete, Stitch along the top edge of the tulle piece using the longest stitch length on the sewing machine. Leave a long tail of thread on each end and do not back tack on either end. Pull on the threads to gather down the tulle piece. You must gather it to be small enough to fit on the lower end of the circular lining piece. Once it is gathered down small enough and all of the gathers are evenly distributed, pin the tulle piece to the lining piece with the right sides together. Once it's pinned all the way, stitch this seam together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock this seam to create a nice neat finish. Attach the skirt lining piece to the main garment at the waist in the same way we attached the main skirt piece. This time, place the lining on top of the bodice piece with the right sides of the bodice facing towards you and the right side of the skirt lining and the tulle facing downwards. The main skirt piece should be on the very bottom. Pin along the waist edge. Stitch in place using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, overlock the centre back edges. The lining layer and the main layer should be caught together. Repeat this for the other side of the centre back also. Open out the invisible zipper and pin each side of the zipper tape to the centre back edge. Stitch each side of the zipper down using the invisible zipper foot, keeping as close to the zipper teeth as possible. A 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance has been given to insert the zipper. Repeat for the other side of the zipper tape. Pin the seam below the base of the zipper closed. The right sides of the garment should be touching. Stitch from the base of the zipper to the hem edge using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, turn down the top edge of the zipper tape and tuck it underneath the centre back seam allowance. Using a hand sewing needle, secure the zipper tape in place at the top edge. Use the iron to press the hem under by 6 mm or a 1/4 of an inch. Stitch using the machine to hold the first fold of the hem in place. Then, repeat this step by turning and pressing the hem again by 6 mm or a 1/4 of an inch. Top stitch along the hem to secure it in place. The final step is adding your trim to the garment. This step is optional, but it is your opportunity to get really creative and personalise your dress. Hand tack your flowers or trim pieces onto the garment. You can cluster your flower trim together or scatter them around the dress. Ensure you only catch the top layer of the main fabric to ensure you have a nice, neat finish on the inside of your garment. Hand tack the flowers in place using a hand sewing needle. Once that's finished, you're all done.